They killed Big Bertha. And that was the moment this stopped being about property lines and started being about war, because you don't spend 3 years hand-feeding an 8-pound largemouth bass every single morning just to watch her float belly up in a pool of blue chemicals because some HOA president decided she owned the view. My name is Elias Thorne, and at 64, I've learned that peace is the most expensive thing you can own, especially when you're living on 60 acres of prime Montana bottomland that's been in your family since the Eisenhower administration. My place, the Silver Creek Ranch, is a slice of heaven tucked between the Bitterroot Range and what used to be empty timberland, but about 10 years ago, the developers moved in like a slow-moving fever, carving up the ridge into what they called, and quote, the Obsidian Heights, and quote, a collection of 700 McMansions with stone veneers and people who think, and quote, nature, and quote, is something you look at through a triple-pane window. I've lived here since I was a kid, back when the air smelled like pine and wet earth instead of fresh asphalt and lawn fertilizer. And for the most part, I stayed on my side of the fence, and they stayed on theirs, until Cynthia Sterling moved into the estate right on the ridge overlooking my private spring-fed lake. Cynthia was the kind of woman who didn't and oppose. T just walk into a room. She audited it, always carrying a leather-bound planner like a shield and wearing sunglasses that cost more than my first tractor. And within 6 months of moving in, she'd maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency with the efficiency of a corporate raider. She didn't like my lake, or more accurately, she didn't like that she couldn't control it, because to her, my property was an, end quote, aesthetic non-compliance zone, end quote, that was single-handedly dragging down the property values of her kingdom on the hill. She started with the letters, official-looking things on heavy cardstock demanding I dismantle my old wooden fishing dock because it didn't, and oppose, meet the, end quote, Obsidian Heights architectural standards, end quote, which was funny to me, seeing as my dock had been standing since 1968 and was, and oppose, part of her damn association to begin with. I remember the first time she actually came down to the fence line, her white SUV idling behind her like a restless beast, and she pointed a manicured finger at my lake and said, end quote, Mr. Thorne, your little pond is an eyesore. It's attracting mosquitoes, and the sight of you sitting out there in that stained lawn chair is frankly distressing to the residents who paid for a pristine mountain experience, end quote. I just looked at her, tipped my cap, and told her that if she didn't, and oppose, like the view, she was more than welcome to close her curtains. But that lake was fed by an artesian spring that had been pure enough to drink since before her daddy was a glint in his father's eye. That's when the real harassment started, the kind of slow-burn, psychological warfare that only people with too much time and money can pull off, starting with her filing a series of bogus environmental complaints claiming I was, end quote, mismanaging a local waterway, end quote. I had county inspectors crawling over my land every other week, guys I'd known for 30 years who would just shrug their shoulders and apologize, saying they had to follow up on every report, even the ones that were clearly insane. When that didn't, and oppose, work, Cynthia hired a high-end survey team to try and prove that the northern edge of my lake actually sat on HOA common ground. And I spent a whole afternoon leaning against a fence post watching 3 guys in neon vests sweat under the sun, only for them to find out that, if anything, her precious community walking trail was actually trespassing 4 feet onto my land. You'd think a normal person would take the hint and back off, but Cynthia Sterling wasn't, and oppose, normal. She was a woman who viewed a, end quote, no, end quote, as a personal insult to her status, and when she realized she couldn't, and oppose, sue me out of existence, she decided to get creative in the worst way possible. One Tuesday morning, I walked down to the water with a handful of feed for Bertha, expecting to see that big dark shadow lurking near the shadows of the dock, but instead I was hit by a smell that made my stomach turn, a sharp, metallic chemical stench that cut through the mountain air like a blade. The water, which usually looked like liquid glass, had turned this sickly, iridescent shade of teal, and when I looked down at the reeds, I saw them. Hundreds of fish, from the little panfish to the big breeders, floating like pale ghosts in the chemical soup. And there, right by the main piling of the dock, was Bertha, her gills stained a horrific shade of copper, her eyes clouded over. And I tell you, I'm a grown man who's seen a lot of hard things, but I sat down on those weathered planks and I cried for a fish and for the 70 years of history that had just been erased by a bucket of poison. I didn't in Oppos. T have to wonder who did it, because parked up on the ridge, looking down through a pair of binoculars from her balcony, was Cynthia, and even from that distance, I could see the smug tilt of her head before she turned and walked back inside her glass house. I call my old friend Silas, who's been a water rights attorney since the mid-'70s, and when he got out there and saw the carnage, his face went from sad to terrifyingly calm, which is how you know a lawyer is about to ruin someone's life. He took samples he called the EPA, and he spent the next 3 days in the county records office while I buried what was left of my lake in Oppos. Life in a trench behind the barn, my heart feeling like a piece of cold flint. On Friday evening, Silas walked into my kitchen, dropped a stack of dusty, yellowed parchment on the table, and said, in quote, "Elias, I hope you're ready, because Cynthia Sterling didn't end Oppos. T just kill your fish, she just handed us the keys to every house on that hill." End quote. He pointed to a deed from 1892, a hand-drawn map that predated the state of Montana itself, which showed that the Silver Creek Ranch didn't end Oppos. T just owned the land. It held the, end quote, senior sovereign water rights, end quote, to the entire subterranean aquifer that fed the valley. It turned out that when the developers built Obsidian Heights, they'd bypassed the city water line to save money, instead drilling 7 deep bore wells that tapped directly into the same underground spring system that fed my lake, but they'd never actually secured the rights to that water. Legally speaking, every time someone in that neighborhood brushed their teeth, filled a swimming pool, or made a pot of coffee, they were technically stealing property that belonged to me. And because the water rights were, in quote, severed, in quote, from the land ownership over a century ago, the HOA had been operating a massive, illegal utility for over a decade. But here was the kicker, the absolute, poetic justice of it all. Cynthia had dumped nearly 40 gallons of industrial-grade copper sulfate into the lake in Oppos. Intake, in quote. End quote. A deep limestone sinkhole where the spring bubbles up from the earth. By doing that, she hadn't in Oppos. T just poisoned my surface water. She had sent a concentrated plume of toxins directly back down into the pressurized aquifer, which meant that within 48 hours, the, in quote, blue death, in quote, she'd intended for my fish was going to start coming out of the taps of all 700 homes in her pristine subdivision. I didn't in Oppos. T say a word to her, I didn't in Oppos. T call, I didn't in Oppos. T shout across the fence, I just waited for the inevitable, and it didn't end Oppos. T take long, because by Sunday morning, the Obsidian Heights community Facebook page was a digital war zone of people posting photos of their blue-tinted bathwater and complaining about a metallic taste that made their kids sick. Cynthia, being the narcissist she was, posted a frantic update claiming it was and quote, temporary mineral imbalance, in quote, caused by recent rains, and told everyone to keep using the water, which was the final nail in her own coffin. That afternoon, the EPA arrived with a hazmat team and a federal warrant, and they didn't in Oppos. T go to my house first. They went straight to the HOA office where Silas and I were already waiting with a sheriff's deputy and a mountain of legal filings that could choke a horse. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a movie. The air was thick with the smell of cheap office coffee and the palpable panic of the HOA board members who were realizing their, in quote, luxury, in quote, lifestyles were about to go up in smoke. Cynthia was there, her hair slightly unraveled for the first time since I'd met her, screaming at a technician about, in quote, interference, in quote, until Silas stepped forward and handed her the injunction that effectively seized control of the neighborhood's water supply. He looked her dead in the eye and said, in quote, Mrs. Sterling, you are being served for the illegal diversion of private water resources, felony environmental contamination of a protected aquifer, and approximately $30 million in back usage EES and damages. And that's before the EPA finishes the paperwork for the federal charges. End quote. Her face went a shade of gray that matched her expensive rug, and for the first time, she had nothing to say, her mouth just opening and closing like one of the fish she'd murdered a few days prior. The fallout was spectacular, the kind of thing they'll be talking about in this county for the next 50 years, because the EPA didn't end Oppos. T just fine her, they treated the whole subdivision like a Superfund site, and because the HOA had failed to disclose the lack of water rights to the homeowners, the lawsuits started flying like locusts. Within a month, the board had dissolved, the developer was being investigated for fraud, and Cynthia was facing a criminal trial for, in quote, reckless endangerment, in quote, and in quote, environmental sabotage, in quote, that carried a potential 10-year prison sentence. But the most satisfying part was an end oppos. The legal victory. It was the morning of the final hearing when I stood on the courthouse steps and she walked past me in handcuffs, her, in quote, property value, in quote, having plummeted to zero and her fancy SUV having been repossessed to pay for the initial cleanup. She looked at me with this pure, unadulterated hatred and hissed, end quote, you ruined everything over a few stupid fish, end quote, and I just smiled, leaning in close so only she could hear, and said, end quote, no, Cynthia, I didn't oppose. Ruin anything. It just reminded you that out here in the real world, you can't poison your neighbor and expect to keep drinking the water, end quote. The lake is recovering now, though it'll be years before the ecosystem is truly back to what it was, but the neighborhood is different too. The new HOA board, or what's left of it, signed a 50-year lease for the water rights that basically pays for the upkeep of my entire ranch and a new wildlife sanctuary on the property. I haven't replaced Bertha yet. I don't think I ever will, but sometimes at sunset, I see a small ripple near the dock, and I like to think it's one of her fry that managed to survive the dark times. People always ask me if I feel bad for the families in the Heights who lost their shirts in the housing market crash that followed the scandal. And honestly, it's a tough one to answer because while they didn't in oppos, pour the poison, they were the ones who put a woman like Cynthia in power and let her run wild as long as their lawn stayed green. It makes you wonder, doesn't, in oppos, how many people are living on top of a disaster they're actively funding just because they like the view from the ridge, and at what point does, in quote, minding your own business, in quote, become a crime in itself when your neighbor is a monster? I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Did I go too far by letting the contamination hit their taps before speaking up? Or was that the only way to make sure the truth actually stuck? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had a neighbor who thought they were above the law. Because I'm starting to think that in the battle between old land and new money, the land always finds a way to win in the end.